When we consider the validity of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform movement, we have to first consider it from three different aspects. We have to examine their doctrinal perspective. We need to look at their prophetic aspect. And we also have to look at their historical aspect. We have to look from all three areas of it. Now, when we think about the doctrinal, we have several video series that help us understand its doctrinal nature. We have the Treasures of Truth video series. And those are 20 videotapes which explain the doctrinal message of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform movement to a non-Adventist person. There are 40 Bible studies in those 20 videotapes. And then we have the Reformation series for those who are of a Seventh-day Adventist background, who want to understand things a little bit deeper with the Bible and the spirit of prophecy. Again, we have 20 videotapes that have 24 Bible studies in those particular series. In addition to the doctrinal aspect, the Reformation series also has some tapes that explain prophecy of the Reform movement, and also has some that explain the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform movement. Now, if you have not had the opportunity to listen to some of these things, it may be better for you to understand some of the basis for our existence, even before we go through some of these historical things that we're going to be studying at right now. It's very important to understand these things. And why is it important? The reason it is important to understand doctrine, the reason it's important to understand prophecy, the reason it's important to understand history. In the book Life Sketches, on page 196, it says, "We have nothing to fear for the future except." Can you imagine that? We don't have to fear the future, but there is some things that will cause us to fear the future. It says we have nothing to fear for the future, except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and His teachings in our past history. It's important to understand God's leading. It's important to understand our history. It's important to understand the doctrinal development in our own history. Now, why is it that in studying the history of God's people, we have to consider the actions of those in positions of responsibility? Sometimes we have to do that as we look at the history of God's church. Whether it's the children of Israel, we have to look at the work of God's leadership there. Sometimes we have to study Adventist history, or even as we study Reform movement history. Why is it important to understand the role of leaders? In Proverbs 29 and verse 12, it says, "If a ruler hearken to lies, all his servants are wicked." Now that's a very strong statement. To say that just because the leader accepts a lie, does that make everyone the same? As honest and sincere as church members may be, the actions of leadership have a profound effect upon the whole church. Did you understand that? Did you realize that? In Volume 3, Testing for the Church, it tells us on page 265, He, speaking of God, would teach His people that disobedience and sin are exceedingly offensive to Him and are not to be lightly regarded. He shows us that when His people are found in sin, they should at once take decided measures to put that sin from them, that His frown may not rest upon them all. Yes, we have a responsibility for other church members. If we allow church members to go in open sin, we bear a responsibility for them. God's frown will rest upon the entire church. It goes on. But if the sins of the people are passed over by those in responsible positions, His frown will be upon them, and the people of God as a body will be held responsible for those sins. So now, if those in responsible positions overlook sins in the membership, then it says that the frown of God will rest upon his people. And we as a people will be held responsible as a body for those sins. This is especially true when we consider the actions of those who have leadership responsibilities at the General Conference level. In Testimonies for the Church, Volume 1, page 596, it says, "At Battle Creek is the great heart of the work." Yes, Battle Creek was the center of the General Conference. "Every pulsation is felt by the members of the body all over the field. If this great heart is in health, a vital circulation will be felt all through the ranks of Sabbath keepers. If the heart is diseased, the languishing condition of every branch of the work will attest to the fact. So if the heart is diseased, if the leadership at the General Conference is diseased, then guess what? The effects will be felt throughout the entire body of believers." Now, the Bible speaks quite a bit about us guarding our words. According to the spirit of prophecy, we are actually influenced not only by someone else's words, but there is a special influence that we have by our own words. That's why it's dangerous to speak things that we really don't believe. In Desire of Ages 3:23, closely connected with Christ's warning in regard to the sin against the Holy Spirit is a warning against idle and evil words. The words are an indication of that which is in the heart. Out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaketh. But the words are more than an indication of character. They have power to react upon the character. Yes, our words have a power to react upon our own character. He continues on. Men are influenced by their own words, often under a momentary impulse prompted by Satan. They give utterance to jealousy or evil surmising, expressing that which they do not really believe, but the expression reacts on the thoughts. They are deceived by their words and come to believe that true which was spoken at Satan's instigation. That's right. Our expressions react upon our own thoughts, and then they create our character. Having once expressed an opinion or decision, they are often too proud to retract it and try to prove themselves in the right until they come to believe that they are. It is dangerous to utter a word of doubt, dangerous to question and criticize divine light. The habit of careless and irreverent criticism reacts upon the character in fostering irreverence and unbelief. Many a man indulging this habit has gone on unconscious of danger until he was ready to criticize and reject the work of the Holy Spirit. Jesus said, "Every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give account thereof in the day of judgment. For by thy words thou shalt be justified, and by thy words thou shalt be condemned." Sometimes a person is tempted to speak words of jealousy or evil surmising, saying that which he really does not believe. The words then react upon our mind, react upon our character, and we actually come to the point of something that we knew was false when we said it, eventually to come to the point in time that we actually believe what we said. That's why our last study that we had, "Take heed how you hear," has a important bearing in our Christian experience. As the coming of Christ draws near, false reports, whether these false reports are genuine person believing that they are false and saying it, or whether they are false reports that a person has said it so often that they actually believe that they are true, will be on the increase. In Testimony for the Church, Volume 5, 295 to 296, Satan hopes to involve the remnant people of God in the general ruin that is coming upon the earth. As the coming of Christ draws nigh, he'll be more determined and decisive in his efforts to overthrow them. Men and women will arise professing to have some new light or some new revelation, whose tendency is to unsettle faith in the old landmarks. Their doctrines will not bear the test of God's word, yet souls will be deceived. And listen to this, false reports will be circulated and some will be taken into snare. False reports come out and some people actually believe it and are deceived. They will believe these rumors and in their turn will repeat them, and thus a link will be formed connecting them with the arch deceiver. In reality, when we believe false reports and when we circulate false reports, we are connected to the arch deceiver. Who is the arch deceiver? Satan? If we believe false reports, if we circulate false reports, we actually connect ourselves to Satan. May the Lord help us that we can truly evaluate ourselves, truly evaluate what is right, what is wrong. Matter of fact, we need to watch out circulating reports anyway. The Bible has a lot to say about talebearers. In order to decipher fact from fiction, we will evaluate quite a few documents in this short time that we have to evaluate the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform movement in connection with that group which calls themselves the International Missionary Society of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform movement. I want to look at how all this happened. In the following presentation, we will place various statements on the screen that are actual quotations. Before each statement, we will endeavor to present the original copy of the statement along with a translation if possible. Some copies are very old and they are not as clear anymore. But in this presentation, as we go through all these documents, I want you to keep something in mind. There's one statement I want us to keep in mind. It's from Volume 4, Testimony for the Church, 595, and it's the second paragraph. It says, ministers who have preached the truth with all zeal and earnestness may apostatize and join the ranks of our enemies. But does this turn the truth of God into a lie? Says the apostle, the foundation of God standeth sure. The faith and feelings of men may change, but the truth of God never. The third angel's message is sounding. It is infallible. It's a tragedy. As I study the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform movement, from its inception in 1914 all the way till today, and not only of the Reform movement, of Adventism as a whole, and not of Adventism as a whole, but all of Christianity, going all the way to the Garden of Eden. One thing that really hurts me as I look at that history, and that is that when difficulties happen, many people turn away from the truth and they become lost. My dear friends, no matter what happens in your life personally, no matter who does what or what happens to you as an individual, I want you to remember one thing, that no matter what people do, the truth does not change. Let me read it again here. The faith and feelings of men may change, but the truth of God never. When? Never. The third angel's message is sounding. It is infallible. After the experience in World War I, when the believers in the third angel's message were disfellowshipped from the church they love, and when these believers began to find out that there were others just like them with similar experiences. They began to pull together, and in various locations, different groups sprang up. And as they had their different groups, they also decided to identify themselves before the world. And they chose different names to identify themselves. In 1919, the brethren in Germany had a special name for themselves. And as you take a look at this document, you will see that the name that they chose was International Missionary Society of the Seventh-day Adventists, standing on the old platform of 1844. It's a little long name, but nonetheless, it was a very descriptive name of who they were. They wanted to identify themselves as believers in not just one locality, especially during World War I, when the various countries fought for their fatherland. They wanted to let people know we are an international group of believers. And they also wanted to know that we are standing on the platform of 1844. In Hungary, and as you take a look at this next document here, we find here that in Hungary, they called themselves the Seventh-day Adventists, standing on the old platform of 1844. This was the name that they selected for themselves. Now, although I don't have documents for the following names, I understand that these other names were used throughout Europe and also in South America. In Transylvania, they called themselves the Adventists of the Ancient Faith. In Romania and Bulgaria, they were Adventists on the basis of the faith of 1844. In Yugoslavia, it was the Remnant Adventists. In Czechoslovakia, the Seed of the Woman. In Scandinavia, Adventists of the Original Faith. And in South America, the 2%. These were various names that they chose for themselves. So the scattered believers each wanted to identify themselves in the various countries in various ways, although they had similarities in their beliefs and similarities in their experiences. The first preliminary meeting of the organization of the Reform movement as a worldwide organization was held in Würzburg, Germany on November 18th, 1921. And in this particular meeting, you had the committee of the German Union was there, the committee from Holland, you had 2 representatives from Sweden, 2 from the Danubian Union, which included Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia, 2 from Switzerland, and 1 from Czechoslovakia. These were the various brethren that got together to try to form some type of an international cohesion with each other. It was a preliminary meeting, and the brethren at that time decided to form what was called the International Committee to coordinate the work in those countries and also to be able to communicate with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which they sent 2 representatives at that point to San Francisco, California in 1922. Now, this information was published in the German paper, the Sabbath Watcher of 1921. After the 2 representatives, Derschler and Spunk-Noble, came back from San Francisco, California, with a disappointment that they experienced there, they published in the Sabbath Watcher for the first time the name of the church, Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement. In 1923, the Seventh-day Adventist European Division gathered together and made a proclamation on their belief in regards to an individual's stance on military issues. They published this in the Review and Herald of March 6, 1924. And here's what it said: "We grant to each of our church members absolute liberty to serve his country at all times and in all places in accord with the dictates of his own personal conscientious conviction." As a result, the believers decided that they need to take a firm stand. The Adventist Church was not going to look back at their pioneering position on the military issue, and so they organized themselves under the name Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement. The brethren had their second preliminary meeting in 1924. At this meeting, they decided to issue the week of prayer for December that year. This particular week of prayer, and as you can see here, we are showing you the publication of the week of prayer in the Hungarian language. And in the Hungarian language week of prayer of 1924, you can see here on this document that it was published by 4 European unions: the German, the Baltic, the Danubian, and the Scandinavian Union. If you will notice, it was published under the name Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement General Conference. Now keep in mind that this was published before the first General Conference session, which was held in 1925. But with their preliminary meetings, they obviously had decided to accept that name. And by publishing this paper in the name of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement General Conference, we can see that those unions at least gave tacit approval to that name. The very first General Conference session was held in Gotha, Germany, from July 14th to 20th, 1925. In 1995, this is going back a few years, I was visiting Germany and we wanted to go visit the castle at Eisenach where Martin Luther spent that 1 year. And as we were driving through the countryside, the very next major town was Eisenach, and we were looking forward to it, and suddenly we saw a sign along the road that said Gotha, Germany. It was so awesome to see that our pioneers met right near where Martin Luther had began that time to reveal the Bible to the world. During that first session of the General Conference, the principles of faith were adopted. And the official name of the church was recognized at that time as the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement General Conference. And we produce here for you a copy of the actual handwritten minutes of the meeting in the original German language. Here we have the front page as well as some of the other pages in this documentation. The translation of Resolution 10 that you see here, the translation of Resolution 10 reads this way: adoption of, and it says here, the principles of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement submitted to the General Conference were adopted after examination and detailed deliberation. 17 delegates voted for their adoption in the original form. 1 delegate had objections because of the formulation with reference to the 144,000. They were accepted by the majority. So here we read, according to this resolution number 10, they recognized that when they got together, all these different groups with all their different names, when they got together in a general conference, they decided upon the name Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement. The next resolution states publication of, this is of the principles of faith. It was unanimously decided to publish the approved principles under the following qualification. And listen to the qualification: the principles of faith of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement and Constitution. Concise presentation published by the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement during the meeting in Gotha from July 14th to 20th, 1925. German Union, Danubian Union, Scandinavian Union, and the Baltic Union. The very first publication of the Principles of Faith in German was published with that name in compliance with the resolutions adopted in 1925. And here you have, we present to you the first page of this Principles of Faith in German, as well as the introduction that you have there. So now you have both the front page and the introduction, and you can see that the original name of this church when organized as a general conference, was the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement. Now, although the General Conference was organized in Gotha, Germany in 1925, it was not immediately registered with the government. And in order to transact business, they made another resolution. This was resolution number 25. And it says this way: the headquarters of the General Conference for the transaction of business, etc., shall remain henceforth at the headquarters of the German Union, but separate from it. So they decided to be at the same headquarters as the German Union. Now, the German Union was already registered. And from 1919 till now, they registered its name as the International Missionary Society of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement, and they used that for legal purposes. And for that reason, the General Conference, since it did not register immediately the name that they decided in session, they went ahead and used the registration of the German Union for legal purposes. And here you have a documentation in which Dmitry Nikolic was issued a credential which included the name International Missionary Society in it. We also show here that as late as 1940, in Australia, D. Nikolic was also using a stamp that bore the name International Missionary Society in it. Now, the brethren at the 1925 session also decided to send two brethren to open up the work in the United States of America. There was some initial contacts in America before that, but this was their official representation. Resolution 17 of 1925 reads, it was decided unanimously to send two brothers to America for the work and adjustment of the American affair. So when they arrived in the United States, they registered a church in New Jersey on March 21st, 1927. And since they were brethren from Germany, they used the same name as in Germany. And here you have this documentation here, as you can see it. They registered the name International Missionary Society of Seventh-day Adventists Reform Movement American Union. That is how they registered it in 1927 here in the United States. Now, for some reason, the brethren responsible for the work of the General Conference neglected to register the General Conference with its own registration. They didn't do it at the time. So at the next session of the General Conference, on July 24th to 30th, 1928, in Inserhagen, Germany, is where the session was held. During that session, they had a resolution made about this. Resolution 30 says, the General Conference shall be legally registered as an organization. With this in view, a statute is to be worked out in the General Conference Committee. So a few years later, in 1928, when they got together again in General Conference, they decided they need to rectify the issue and they need to register the General Conference with its own registration. And so the first thing you had to do was make out its own statutes. And this was done about a year later on June 30th, 1928 by the members of the committee. They finally went ahead and got together and formed these documentations. Now, since the General Conference was together with the German Union at the same location, they had some issues that kind of developed there. To have a nice building, they both invested money together, the German Union and the General Conference. And of course, the property, legally, everything was in the name of the German Union. Later on, the German Union president decided that he wanted to take everything with him. He decided to leave the connection with the General Conference, and he wanted to take all the financial assets with him. And as a result, in order to preserve the assets of the General Conference, the General Conference leadership, after talking with legal advice, decided to register the General Conference using the similar name to the Union in order to be able to maintain some of the assets. And in the registration document, as you can see here in Article 4, Paragraph 7, it states there that the committee gave the right and authority to the president and to the vice president to make some changes in the statutes when necessary to bring the society into alignment with governmental regulations. And they felt they could do that, and so what they did on January 11th, 1929, they registered the General Conference name under International Missionary Society of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement General Conference. And here you have a copy of that along with its translation. And this particular registration was used for the General Conference for a period of 7 years. On April 29th, 1936, the German government decided to dissolve the General Conference, to confiscate their goods and their property, and to cancel their registration. And here is a copy of the letter from the government of Germany, Hitler's Germany. And here's what it states, translation of the version that you just saw. In accordance with Section 1 of the People's Ordinance for the Reich, President for the Protection of the People and the State of February 28, 1933, Reich's Law, Publication 1, page 83, the sect, Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement, is herewith dissolved and prohibited in the whole of the German Reich. Their property is confiscated. Actions contrary to this ordinance will be punished in accordance with Section 4 of the People's Ordinance of February 28, 1933. Reasons. The Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement pursues goals under the cover of religious activities that are contrary to the world vision of National Socialism. The members of this sect refuse to perform military service and give the German salute. They openly declare that they know no fatherland but are internationally oriented and regard all men as their brethren. Because of the stand of this sect is liable to create confusion among the population, its dissolution was necessary for the protection of people and the state. And it was signed by this representative, Heydrich. So from the time that it was dissolved in April 1936 until 1948, the General Conference fled. They fled with their papers, they fled with everything they can get a hold of, and they fled to Switzerland. And it was operating from Basel, Switzerland. The name, again, used in most official correspondence at that time was Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement General Conference. And here we show you a couple of documentation. We will look at this documentation a little bit later on in detail, but right here, if you'll just notice that the stamp that is used is Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement. Now, the name International Missionary Society was used in different places even after that until as late as 1948. During World War II, there was no possibility to hold a General Conference session. Obviously, the state of affairs in Europe and around the world made it such that a General Conference session could not be held. Now, the act of not holding a General Conference session does not dissolve the organizational structure. The work still went forward in the hands of those leaders that were elected at the previous session. The very next session that could be held after World War II was at The Hague in 1948. Now, the previous session was held in Budapest, Hungary in 1934, September. Period of nearly 14 years without a General Conference session. During this time, the president of the Reform Movement, Brother Maas, died, and Brother Albert Mueller, the vice president, took over the responsibilities of the presidency. Now, our next presentation will be addressing issues that are specifically related to the 1948 session. We're going to look at some of the documentations that revolved around that session, some of the issues that were resolved, and so we'll have to wait for that for our next meeting.